Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. We're here today to tackle a concept that, well, it really makes you reevaluate history. We often talk about post-colonial Africa, right? As if colonialism is firmly in the past, like a neat closed chapter in the history books. But what if the very structures of power, the way societies are organized, even how people think, what if they're still deeply shaped by that history? What if decolonization was maybe in many ways an illusion of freedom? Today, we're taking a deep dive into precisely that, the concept of coloniality of power in post-colonial Africa. And this isn't just, a dry historical examination. It's really about understanding the enduring shadow of colonial rule, how it persists right here in the present. We'll explore how power dynamics, economic systems, even identities, how they continue to be influenced long after the flags of independence were raised and the colonial administrators, well, packed their bags. It's definitely a lens through which we can maybe better understand many contemporary challenges.
And we have an incredible stack of sources for this deep dive, really a rich collection of research, scholarly articles, critical analyses that really peel back the layers of this complex topic. Our mission today is to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, helping you understand not just what happened, but why it continues to matter so much today. So get ready for some, I think, surprising facts and maybe some aha moments that we hope will definitely shift your perspective a bit.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot to unpack here. We'll start by clarifying the distinct meaning of coloniality versus colonialism. That's crucial. Then we'll look into the violent architecture of colonial sovereignty that really shaped the continent. We'll trace the evolution of economic exploitation, from that direct control to the more subtle neocolonial mechanisms that arguably persist today. We'll examine how identities were deliberately fragmented, sometimes even constructed, and how colonial patterns of violence were disturbingly often reproduced in post-colonial governance. But crucially, we'll also explore the powerful forms of resistance that emerged and the ongoing intellectual struggle to truly decolonize the mind, which is a project that very much continues to this day. It's a complex journey, for sure, but I think an essential one to really grasp Africa's present and, its future.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Let's unpack this. Many of us, myself included, we tend to think colonialism ended when the colonizers left, right, new flags went up. We sort of imagine this clear break, a definitive end to an era. But our sources, they draw this really crucial distinction between colonialism and coloniality. And it sounds like a distinction that truly changes everything about how we understand this period and, maybe more importantly, its aftermath.
That's absolutely the fundamental starting point, yeah. And it's critical not to, conflate the two. Colonialism, as our sources generally define it, refers to that direct political and economic control of one nation by another. It's about a specific historical period. Roughly the 16th to the mid-20th century is characterized by direct occupation, the physical presence of imperial powers, setting up administrative structures, overt policies of subjugation.
So the boots on the ground, the flags, the governors.
Exactly. The visible apparatus of rule. When imperial powers physically administered territories, extracted resources, imposed their will directly through, visible governance. Now, what's fascinating, and maybe far more insidious, as these sources argue, is coloniality. It's not just the historical event that ended, it's described as the long-standing patterns of power that were born out of colonialism. And these patterns continue to define culture, labor relations, social structures, even how knowledge itself is produced, long after those direct colonial administrations packed up and left.
Wow.
Yeah, it's presented as this systemic, pervasive force that actually survives the formal end of colonialism. It stays alive, in books, in academic criteria, cultural patterns, common sense assumptions, even in the self-images people hold. It's described as a structural matrix of power that fundamentally shapes the global order even when the colonial masters are formally gone.
That's a really powerful distinction. So, okay, if colonialism was the overt physical occupation, the direct rule.
Yeah.
Coloniality sounds almost like, a lingering phantom, a set of invisible operating instructions.
That's not a bad analogy, actually.
Shaping things even when the visible structures are gone. It's not just about who holds power now, but the very rules of the game they might still be playing by.
Exactly. It's the underlying logic, the deep structure.
Can you give an example, maybe something tangible, something an everyday listener might encounter or observe, where this ghost in the machine, as you put it, still operates in a seemingly post-colonial society?
Sure. It could be something as seemingly mundane as the continued privileging of European languages, say English or French or Portuguese, in higher education or government, right?
Yeah.
Even if indigenous languages are spoken widely by the population.
Right.
Or Think about the continued reliance on economic models and development theories that originated in the West, often sidelining or dismissing local traditional approaches to, say, resource management or community organization that might be more sustainable or culturally appropriate. These aren't direct colonial edicts anymore, obviously, but they are these deeply embedded patterns of thinking and valuing certain ways of knowing or doing things over others, patterns that persist. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, our sources really emphasize that coloniality isn't just a remnant, some leftover dust from a bygone era. It's presented as a constitutive element of the global capitalist power model itself.
Constitutive, meaning it's like built into the foundation.
Yes, precisely. Its cornerstone, according to these analyses, was the systematic imposition of a racial and ethnic classification of the entire global population. And this wasn't just, casual categorization like we might think of it today. It was deliberately designed to organize the world into this rigid hierarchy.
A hierarchy of
Superior and inferior people. That was the explicit logic. And this hierarchy fundamentally structured the international division of labor, global social systems, and even who gets to produce and define what counts as valid knowledge.
And I imagine Africans were placed right at the very bottom of that hierarchy from the outset, serving as kind of the foundation for this global racialized structure.
Absolutely. That's central to the argument. Europeans strategically positioned themselves at the apex, justifying their dominance through, what we now recognize as pseudoscientific racial theories, while others, particularly Africans, were systematically relegated to an inferior level, often described as biologically, intellectually, and culturally deficient, lacking history, lacking complexity.
Right.
This racial and ethnic classification wasn't just about social status. It was a deeply ingrained ideology. It justified exploitation. It shaped everything from economic roles, who does what kind of labor, to intellectual positioning, who gets to speak, whose knowledge matters. And fundamentally, it determined access to resources and power. Our sources use this powerful phrase that Africans and others breathe and live coloniality constantly. Yeah, emphasizing its pervasive, multidimensional impact on everyday social existence, whether that's material conditions or, subjective experience. It's described as this constant, almost invisible framework that dictates their positioning in the global order, influencing how they are perceived by others, and crucially, how they might perceive themselves. It defines economic, political, and even intellectual positioning.
That's a chilling assertion, that the very foundation of the global capitalist model rests in this idea of superior and inferior people. It's profound. If this classification was so fundamental, how did they actually sustain it? Was it purely through raw force, or were there more, maybe subtle ways this hierarchy was reinforced in daily life, beyond just the obvious economic roles? How did they actually build this architecture of control on such a, frankly, dehumanizing premise?
That's the critical question, isn't it? And the answer is multifaceted, but violence was absolutely central. The very authority of the colonial state, colonial sovereignty, it rested on a foundation of profound and systematic violence. It wasn't just incidental, it was the system, intricately designed for control. Our sources meticulously outline 3 distinct sorts of violence that underpin this authority, not just as isolated acts, but as intrinsic elements of its very operation.
Okay, 3 types. First, there was what they call founding violence. This is essentially the right of conquest. The initial brutal force the military might use to seize territories, establish control, often with devastating human cost. Subjugation.
Right, the initial invasion.
Exactly. Second, there was legitimation violence. This was violence used to justify the colonial order itself. It often involved framing colonial rule as necessary, even beneficial, cloaked in the rhetoric of the civilizing mission, bringing education, Christianity, progress, which conveniently disguised the underlying brutality and exploitation. It silenced dissent by framing it as savage.
And third, perhaps most pervasively, was maintenance violence. This ensured the permanence of colonial rule. It manifested through recurring, often mundane, acts of coercion and repression in daily life. Things like forced labor, arbitrary punishments, everyday policing, constant surveillance.
So violence wasn't just an occasional tool like putting down a rebellion. It was the very basis, the daily operation of the entire system, woven into the fabric.
Absolutely. Integral, foundational, and continuous. This sovereignty was characterized by indiscriminate force, and crucially, the power to disqualify anything that contested its authority as savage and outlaw. This effectively denied any legitimacy to indigenous resistance or alternative forms of governance. You couldn't challenge it because you were deemed inherently incapable of legitimate challenge. The exercise of power involved compelling people to perform obligations, pay taxes, provide labor, follow orders through demands backed by the constant threat of force. Essentially, it was about issuing and enforcing commands without question. This violence permeated everything, from the macro-level conquests down to micro-actions in daily life, deliberately creating what our sources call petty fears among the populace, a constant low-level anxiety.
Petty fears, that's evocative.
Isn't it? And corporal punishment, for instance, using whips made of hippopotamus hide like the Manigal or Jambok, wasn't just an occasional act, it was an accepted, routinized, and very public practice. Public executions, too, were not just punishments. They were public, highly visible acts where the state dramatically asserted its total power, spectacles of power. And chillingly, our sources mention these created a perverse economy of death that was sometimes met with wild applause from certain quarters. This spectacle was meant to instill terror and submission, a public lesson.
Wild applause for public executions. That's a truly disturbing image. It's almost beyond comprehension for many of us today. It speaks to a profound psychological conditioning, doesn't it? Both of the colonizer and, tragically, maybe of some of the colonized. Did the sources offer any insight into why some might applaud? I mean, beyond just coercion or fear. What does that tell us about the depths of this dehumanization, that such an act could possibly be met with wild applause?
It points to a terrifying normalization of extreme violence, and a deeply warped social order. The sources imply it's likely a combination of factors, certainly enforced fear, performing loyalty to avoid a similar fate, but also perhaps a deep-seated internalization of the colonial imaginary, the worldview that depicted the condemned as less than human, as deserving their fate as other.
Right.
This normalization is really central to the concept of commandment, which our sources identify as a quintessential form of colonial authority.
Commandment.
Yeah. It essentially means unfettered rule by decree, standing entirely above any judicial or parliamentary restraint that might have existed, say, back in the metropole.
So completely arbitrary power.
Exactly. Colonial sovereignty, through commandment, eliminated all distinction between ends and means. The act justified itself. This allowed for, well, virtually infinite permutations between what was considered just and unjust, solely at the discretion of the colonial power. The governor-general, often called the supreme chief, could literally rule by proclamation without any accountability whatsoever. Absolute power in their hands.
So zero checks and balances. Literally absolute power, where the leader's word was the only law. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Power was fused in the person of the local administrator or the chief appointed by the colonials, combining judicial, legislative, executive, administrative functions all in one person or office. Our sources describe this as being like a clenched fist over the peasantry, signifying absolute, inescapable control over every aspect of their lives.
A clenched fist.
Yeah. And this fusion allowed for considerable systemic abuse. Because there was no separation of powers, no independent judiciary to protect the colonized from arbitrary rule. Even things like the repugnancy clause you sometimes see in colonial legal frameworks, which ostensibly required indigenous custom not to be repugnant to justice and morality.
Right, that sounds reasonable on the surface.
On the surface, yes. But in practice, it primarily served to reinforce colonial power, not uphold genuine humanitarian principles. It was a legal tool to dismiss any indigenous custom or practice that challenged colonial authority or norms. So their interpretation of justice and morality was the only one that counted. It essentially created a parallel moral universe where colonial actions were always justifiable.
It's like they created their own moral universe where only their will mattered, and their interpretation of justice was the only one that counted. A system where what's just is defined solely by those in power, with no external accountability. Terrifying.
That's a very astute observation, yeah. And this commandment, this absolute rule, it operated as what the sources call a régime d'exception, a state of exception. Meaning, it fundamentally departed from common law principles that might apply elsewhere, even back in Europe. This extraordinary system delegated vast private rights and privileges to individuals and companies, often resembling the feudal power structures of earlier eras, but on a massive industrial scale. Concessionary companies, for instance, these private firms granted huge territories to exploit.
Right, I've heard of those.
They were endowed with immense privileges and immunities, including, astonishingly, the rights to levy taxes on the population within their concession, raise their own private troops or police forces, make war on local communities who resisted, mint their own coinage sometimes, and even be exempt from colonial duties or taxes themselves.
That's an incredible amount of power for private companies.
They essentially became mini-states within the colonial state, with their own armies and currencies operating purely for profit above all else.
They absolutely did. And these benefits, these immense powers, were of course enjoyed at the direct and often horrific expense of the colonized population. A stark and truly tragic example, which our sources highlight extensively, is the Congo Free State.
King Leopold's Congo.
Exactly. Established in 1885 after the Berlin Conference scrambled for Africa, this vast territory, larger than Western Europe, was not a Belgian colony in the traditional sense initially. It was the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium.
Personal property. An entire country.
Yeah. His governance was driven solely by an unrestrained profit motive, completely unburdened by moral or ethical values or even Belgian parliamentary oversight at first. He literally treated the Congolese people as his personal property, subject to his absolute will exercised through his agents. He used the legal concept of terre vacante, or vacant lands, to justify widespread land expropriation. Claiming land that had been inhabited, farmed, hunted on for generations was somehow empty and thus his for the taking.
Right.
Extremely. Indigenous people were forcibly regrouped into settlements that functioned essentially as ethnicized rural labor camps to provide quotas of rubber and ivory. The infamous Force Public, his private army, often staffed by mercenaries and other Africans press-ganged into service, ruthlessly enforced these quotas, armed with modern weapons and the notorious Chicote, the bullwhip.
I've read about the atrocities.
Horrific. Failure to meet quotas resulted in torture, village burnings, hostage-taking, and the infamous practice of cutting off hands, sometimes of the living, sometimes of the dead, as proof that quotas were being enforced or bullets hadn't been wasted. Widespread killings were routine. This systematic brutality led to an estimated death toll from violence, starvation, disease exceeding 10 million Congolese people during Leopold II's personal rule, a truly staggering figure. It underscores the horrific human cost when private profit is unbound by any human consideration.
10 million. It's almost impossible to grasp that scale of devastation.
It is. And the international outcry, thankfully led by figures like Edmund Morel, Roger Casement, even Mark Twain, eventually forced Leopold to cede control to the Belgian state in 1908. But the brutal system, while perhaps slightly moderated, continued, and the damage was profound and lasting.
Here's where it gets really interesting, or maybe horrifyingly interesting. The intertwining of private profit and state-sanctioned brutality to such a devastating degree. It just truly underscores how human lives were completely deprioritized, seen as expendable resources in the pursuit of raw materials and personal enrichment. The scale of that violence is almost incomprehensible, not just in numbers, but in its methodical, profit-driven nature.
And this wasn't entirely an isolated incident, though perhaps the most extreme example. It was an extreme manifestation of the logic inherent in parts of the colonial system. Now, to manage this complex and brutal control across vast territories, the colonial state is often described in our sources as Janus face, like the Roman god with two faces looking in opposite directions, and bifurcated, meaning it had two distinct forms of power operating under a single overarching hegemonic authority.
Two faces for different populations, right?
Yeah.
One set of rules for the colonizers and another much harsher set for the colonized.
Yeah.
But all under one ultimate control.
Exactly. You had urban power, which spoke the language of civil society, civil rights, law courts, property rights. This applied primarily to Europeans and maybe to a very small, carefully selected class of civilized or assimilated Africans who were granted some privileges. This urban sphere was organized, at least in theory, on the principle of differentiation of power, some separation between administration and judiciary, at least for the settlers.
Okay.
But then, in stark contrast, you had rural power. This operated through what were called native authorities, designed specifically for the vast indigenous majority living outside the main towns. This rural sphere spoke the language of community, tradition, and custom. And crucially, it was organized on the principle of the fusion of power we just discussed, where chiefs, often appointed or approved by the colonial state, held absolute unchecked authority locally.
Right, the clenched fist again.
Precisely. This created a system of institutional segregation. Europeans had a central, supposedly modern state with codified laws and rights for themselves. Africans in the countryside had a local native state governed by an invented or manipulated customary order. This denied them full citizenship rights and subjected them to a different, much more coercive legal and administrative regime.
So it wasn't just physical segregation like separate neighborhoods. It was two completely different logics of governance applied to different populations, almost like parallel universes within the same territory. Imagine living in the same country, but having entirely different rule books, one for citizens with some rights and another for natives under absolute local authority, an authority often designed specifically to extract labor and resources. It must have been incredibly disorienting and deeply disempowering for the majority.
It absolutely was. It was a deliberate strategy to fragment and control. And this bifurcated state, this two-phase system, needed local agents to function in the vast rural areas. So a core strategy was to containerize Africans as tribespeople. Colonial policy actively created, solidified, and sometimes even invented tribal identities where they hadn't existed in such rigid forms before.
Right.
Each designated tribe was then defined as a distinct cultural group with its own specific customary law, which, as we've said, was often invented or sculpted by colonial administrators and anthropologists to serve colonial needs like indirect rule and reinforced control, rather than genuinely reflecting fluid pre-colonial norms and practices. For example, in many areas, the colonial administration would identify or even appoint a paramount chief where no such single figure of authority existed before, simply to have a single point of contact and control for a region.
Invented. Custom. That sounds incredibly cynical. Essentially manufacturing tradition to suit their own administrative convenience and political agenda, rather than respecting existing, often more complex or decentralized social structures.
It was profoundly cynical, yes. Customary law under colonialism became state-ordained and state-enforced. It wasn't an organic reflection of pre-colonial practices evolving over time. Its primary purpose became enforcing custom as defined by the state, maintaining order, facilitating labor extraction, not guaranteeing rights for the colonized. If anything, it limited their rights compared to settlers. Its domain was extensive, covering critical areas like land tenure, who could use what land and under what conditions, personal relations like marriage, inheritance, even controlling movement, and access to productive resources. Land, crucially, was often explicitly defined as a customary communal holding, with access controlled not by individuals directly, but by the state-appointed customary authorities, the chiefs.
Oh.
This definition of land was a deliberate strategy. It aimed partly to limit the full impact of market forces on peasant production, ensuring peasants still had access to some land for subsistence, which kept labor costs low for colonial enterprises. But it also made access dependent on the chief, reinforcing his power and, through him, the colonial state's power. It made force and the market appear as complementary twins for economic extraction.
And the chiefs were absolutely key to this system then. Acting as the local face of colonial power, often completely beholden to the colonizers for their position and authority.
Indeed. The native authorities comprising this hierarchy of chiefs, paramount chiefs, sub-chiefs, headmen, were the primary agents of this system of indirect rule. They were often appointed, supported, and crucially could be dismissed by colonial powers to ensure their subservience. Their authority increasingly derived from the colonial state, not necessarily from the consent or traditions of their own people. For example, the Natal Native Code in South Africa, back in 1891, explicitly specified forced labor duties that chiefs were required to extract from their people for the colonial administration, highlighting their direct role in the coercive economic system. Rhodesian colonialism, in what became Zimbabwe, went further. It systematically categorized the population into rigid racial and ethnic groups, creating this ethnic citizenship enforced through identity cards, the infamous Sukwa. These cards dictated where one could live, work, what land rights they had, even who they could vote for in the limited franchise.
So your tribe defined your legal status.
Precisely. And even academic work, like the linguistic work of Clement Dogue in the 1930s to create a standard Shona language. While seemingly a neutral scholarly effort,
Right.
our sources argue it inadvertently contributed to the manufacturing of greater regional Shona identity, in opposition to an equally manufactured greater Ndebele regional identity. This wasn't just about control in the moment. It was about actively sculpting and formalizing ethnic divisions, drawing boundaries that served colonial administrative and political interests, and tragically sowing seeds of future discord and conflict by creating these larger, sometimes artificial, group identities in opposition to each other.
It's truly fascinating how the tools of scholarship, like linguistics, could be weaponized, even perhaps unintentionally sometimes, to fragment a population for political control. It really highlights the insidious reach of coloniality, how it permeated even seemingly neutral domains.
It absolutely does. And underpinning this entire edifice, this whole system of control, violence, and division at its very root, was an imaginary, a worldview that conceived of the native, the African, as essentially an animal or a thing. They were seen as lacking full humanity, lacking agency, lacking the capacity for reason, for transcendence, for self-governance. Their very existence was often deemed stupid and imbecilic in colonial writings, a complete denial of their
A
personhood.
complete denial of their personhood, reducing entire populations to mere objects for exploitation or administration.
Yeah.
It's truly a horrifying foundation for any system of governance.
Yes. Their body, in this view, was considered property,
Mhm.
subject to forced labor, arbitrary taxes, physical punishment, classification, measurement, control. This was all part of a domestication process, ironically framed as necessary to cure perceived laziness and increase productivity for the colonial economy, essentially treating human beings like livestock to be managed and exploited.
Domestication. That word choice is chilling.
It is, and this profound dehumanization served to justify all forms of violence, exploitation, and repression. It made the hellish life imposed on the colonized seem acceptable, even necessary, within that colonial mindset. Our sources cite this chilling phrase, reportedly common among some Europeans in Africa: beyond the equator there are no sins.
Wow.
Yeah. It encapsulates how ethics, morality, and law were effectively suspended when dealing with non-European peoples. Concepts like killability and rapeability were in essence inscribed into their very images, making violence against them permissible, even unremarkable within that system. This is the essence of what scholars like Maldonado Torres call coloniality of being, the profound dehumanization and depersonalization of colonized Africans into literally the wretched or the condemned denied full humanity, existing primarily as objects of colonial power rather than subjects with their own will, history, and destiny. It's a stripping away of one's very essence, a profound ontological violence.
Damnés. The condemned. That's incredibly powerful and bleak. It sets the stage perfectly, unfortunately, for understanding the economic exploitation that went hand in hand with this.
Absolutely. Building on that foundation of dehumanization and total control, the economic exploitation under colonialism was systematic and often brutally enforced. The so-called free peasantry, even those who still had customary access to some land, were subjected to what economists call extra economic coercion to push them into the colonial economy.
Extra economic coercion. Meaning what exactly?
It means direct intervention of force into the process of production beyond just simple market incentives like wages or prices. The goal was extraction, pure and simple, not reciprocal exchange or fair trade.
So not just relying on market forces, but outright compulsion and violence to extract labor and resources. It was a system built on forced participation then.
Exactly. This coercion took various forms, widespread across the continent. It included forced labor, often unpaid or minimally paid, for public works like building roads, railways, government buildings, or even for private European-owned plantations or mines. It included forced cultivation of specific cash crops, cotton, coffee, cocoa, ground nuts, deemed necessary for the colonial economy, often at the expense of food crops for local consumption. Or sometimes forced cultivation of food crops for the colonial administration or workforce.
Right.
It included forced sales of products at prices dictated by the administration, well below market rates, and the imposition of various taxes, head taxes, hut taxes, poll taxes payable only in colonial currency, which forced people into the cash economy, usually by working for the colonizers or selling their produce cheaply just to get the cash to pay the tax.
So the tax itself was a tool of control.
Absolutely. A key tool. Force was not seen as the opposite of the market in this context, but as its complementary twin. They worked together to ensure the extraction of labor and products from peasant households for the benefit of the metropole, the colonial power. For example, the French administration, like other colonial powers, heavily relied on the chiefs they controlled to collect these taxes and to requisition labor for colonial projects. The chief became the local enforcer. A striking specific example from our sources is a 1956 bylaw. This is quite late in the colonial period, mind you, in the Handeni district of Tanganyika, which was then under British rule.
Okay.
This bylaw mandated that every household must plant specific food crops, like 1 acre of cassava or 2 acres of sorghum. Failure to do so was punishable by 3 months imprisonment.
3 months in jail for not planting cassava.
Exactly. And the district commissioners, the British officials, explicitly stated in their reports that campaigns to increase food production must be waged through propaganda and education, and crucially, on no account take the form of increased prices.
Wow. That's incredibly revealing. Deliberately avoiding market incentives like paying people a fair price for their crops in favor of administrative coercion and punishment.
It really shows the system's priorities, doesn't it?
Huh.
Direct control over market-driven engagement. This wasn't about fostering a thriving local economy. It was purely about extraction and subjugation.
Precisely. It perfectly illustrates the logic. And this logic of exploitation, this focus on extraction and control, regrettably, didn't just vanish with formal independence. This brings us directly to the concept of neocolonialism. Our sources describe neocolonialism as a state that is, on paper, independent. It has its own flag, its anthem, its seat at the UN.
Right.
But its economic system and often its political policy are, in reality, directed from outside, by former colonial powers or increasingly by international financial institutions or multinational corporations. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president and a key thinker on this, argued passionately that neocolonialism wasn't actually a sign of imperialism's strength. Instead, he saw it as its last hideous gasp.
Interesting. Why a gasp?
Because it represented imperialism's inability to rule by the old, direct methods due to nationalist resistance. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control, to maintain the flow of wealth, through new, less overt, more insidious means, indirect control.
Okay, so how does it work then? If there's no direct rule, no physical occupation, no governor issuing decrees, how do they maintain control from outside when the formal structures are gone?
Well, according to thinkers like Nkrumah and others cited in our sources, it operates by fundamentally postponing the facing of the social issues within the dominant capitalist countries, externalizing their problems, by essentially transferring the burdens and contradictions of capitalism onto the developing world. This effectively widens the gap between rich and poor nations. The developing world often bears the brunt of economic downturns, environmental degradation, or resource depletion driven by the core economies. It transforms national crises within capitalist countries into international ones. The danger then shifts, as Nkrumah warned, from civil conflict within nations to international war provoked ultimately by the misery of the majority of mankind who daily grow poorer and poorer. A recipe for global instability.
That's a heavy perspective.
It is, and our sources highlight the work of the late Egyptian economist Samir Amin, who identified what he called the 5 monopolies used by the dominant Western world, the triad of North America, Western Europe, and Japan, to maintain the subjugated position of developing nations, including those in Africa.
Okay, 5 monopolies. What are they?
First, the monopoly of technology. Developing nations struggle to innovate or compete when they lack access to cutting-edge research, patents, and development controlled by dominant powers, creating a perpetual dependency on imported, often expensive or outdated, technologies.
Right.
Second, control over global finances. Dominance of international monetary systems, capital flows, credit ratings, banking giving external actors huge leverage over national economies. Third, control over access to natural resources. Even if the resources are physically located in African lands, the control over their extraction, their pricing on global markets, and crucially, the processing and value addition often lies with external corporations or powers. Africa exports raw materials cheap, imports finished goods dear.
A classic pattern.
Classic, yes. Fourth, control over international communication and media, shaping global narratives, controlling information flows, often reinforcing Western perspectives and stereotypes, and marginalizing African voices and viewpoints. And fifth, a monopoly on military means of mass destruction, the ultimate guarantor of global power, maintaining a hierarchical global security order where challenges to the status quo can be met with overwhelming force.
So these 5 monopolies, they create this powerful interlocking web of control that maintains these neocolonial relationships even without soldiers on the ground.
Exactly. It's a structural form of domination, and control is achieved through various subtle yet incredibly powerful mechanisms within this structure. Financial and monetary control is particularly key. For instance, aid payments, often presented as benevolent assistance towards state running costs or development projects, but frequently structured as revolving credit, according to Dupa. This means the money is paid by the neocolonial master, or an institution they dominate, passes through the neocolonial state's budget, and ultimately returns to the master, maybe as payment for overpriced goods from the donor country, maybe as profits for their firms operating locally, or simply as repayment of previous debts.
So the aid money just makes a round trip.
Often, yes, with added benefits for the donor. Foreign exchange systems and banking are also frequently controlled or heavily influenced by the former imperial power. Their nationals might sit on the administrative councils of central banks in former colonies, giving them significant, sometimes absolute, control over monetary policy, exchange rates, and external payments. Loans, too, are a major tool, often offered with high interest rates and short call-in periods, leading to crippling foreign debts that accumulate rapidly, often far exceeding the amount of aid received, creating a debt trap. And even multilateral aid from institutions like the IMF and World Bank, though seemingly neutral, typically comes with strings attached. Strict, offensive conditions, as our sources call them. They review government policies, supervise how loans are used, demand structural adjustments. This is strikingly akin to the historical tutelage imposed on indebted nations like Egypt and Tunisia back in the 1870s, where international creditors basically took direct control over domestic economic management. History repeating itself, perhaps.
So this really suggests that what's often presented as aid or development assistance wasn't always, or perhaps even primarily, about genuine, locally driven development, but very often about maintaining control, ensuring economic alignment, and securing a return on investment for the former colonial powers and their financial institutions. It's a very different picture than the usual narrative.
It's certainly the critical perspective offered in these sources, yes. A sophisticated web designed, consciously or unconsciously, to perpetuate dependence rather than foster true autonomous independence. And this extends beyond just finance. Think about trade and economic policy dictation. Tide aid, for example, is a classic mechanism.
Just Tide aid.
It's aid given on the condition that the recipient country must spend it on goods and services from the donor country. This forces neocolonial states to import manufactured goods from the imperial power, often uncompetitive products that are surplus back home, rather than sourcing from the most efficient global market or, crucially, developing their own industries.
So it benefits the donor's economy more than the recipient's.
Often, yes. Imperialist specialists, advisors from international institutions, often historically urged developing countries to focus primarily on agriculture, on exporting raw materials, and to defer industrialization. This strategy was explicitly aimed, according to critics like Nkrumah, at maintaining dependence, ensuring a steady supply of cheap primary products for the industrial core in the West, and preventing former colonies from becoming economic competitors by developing their own manufacturing base.
Keep them producing raw stuff, we'll do the profitable manufacturing.
That's the essence of it. Then there's balkanization. This refers to the deliberate breaking up of large colonial territories. Think of French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, British East Africa into numerous small, often economically non-viable states at independence. These smaller states often lack the resources, market size, or political clout for truly independent development, forcing them to rely heavily on the former imperial powers for defense agreements, security, economic systems, even currency zones.
Like the Frank Zone.
Exactly, that's a prime example we'll come back to. And finally, more recently, you have the era of structural adjustment programs, pushed heavily by the IMF and World Bank from the 1980s onwards. These programs typically mandated drastic cuts in public spending, privatization of state-owned assets and services, deregulation, trade liberalization, often leading to the dismantling of the state's capacity, a shift of public capital into private hands, often foreign, increased inequality, social unrest, and sometimes further fragmentation and violence as state authority weakened.
The example of the African Frank Zone you mentioned is particularly striking here. Our sources explain how even today the foreign exchange reserves of these 14 or so African nations are still pooled in an account at the French Treasury in Paris.
That's correct.
And French approval, or at least influence, is essential for major monetary policy decisions in these sovereign countries. It's such a very tangible, ongoing example of diminished sovereignty, isn't it? Where financial independence is still a distant dream, decades after political independence.
It is a powerful, concrete example. These states effectively remain, in some analyses, small huts within bigger neocolonial houses, with diminished real sovereignty over key aspects of their foreign policy, economic strategy, monetary systems, and even defense matters. This is really the core of how African leaders, even those with genuine intentions, can find themselves entrapped within a disciplining colonial matrix of power, unable to fully determine their country's development paths without external approval or facing severe financial consequences. It perpetuates a state of what some call neocolonized paralysis.
And trapped within a disciplining colonial matrix of power, that phrase really captures the structural nature of this, the lack of genuine autonomy. Which leads us to think about identity, because colonialism didn't just control land and economies, it profoundly reshaped how people saw themselves and each other, didn't it?
Absolutely. The colonial project fundamentally reshaped, redefined, and often outright imposed identities across the continent, starting with the very concept of Africa itself. As our courses point out, the name Africa itself is an external label. Its origins are complex, but it's traceable back to Roman times, initially referring just to a small part of North Africa. Its application to the entire continent was a much later European imposition.
Interesting. So the continental identity itself was framed from outside?
Initially, yes. And more broadly, colonial powers systematically imposed identities onto the diverse peoples they encountered. They typified Africans using broad, often derogatory, homogenizing labels: barbarians, primitives, natives, blacks, Negroes, Bantu. These labels stripped away the rich, diverse, complex historical identities, languages, political structures that existed before colonialism, replacing them with these simplistic, often racist categories designed for administrative convenience and justification of rule.
And they actively worked to prevent Africans from forming broader, unifying national identities, didn't they?
Yeah.
Keeping them divided along these imposed or exaggerated ethnic lines to maintain control and prevent unified resistance.
Yes, that was a deliberate and widely used strategy: divide and rule. Colonialism actively fostered divisions, systematically preventing African identities from coalescing into larger, unified national ones that could pose a serious challenge to colonial rule. This created a lasting and deeply problematic legacy where ethnic identities were deliberately politicized. They were hardened, codified, sometimes even invented, specifically to prevent unity against the common colonizer.
Right.
For instance, Rhodesian colonialism, as we mentioned, categorized the population into rigid racial and ethnic groups, creating this ethnic citizenship enforced through identity cards. Your tribe determined your rights, where you could live, work. And even academic work, like Doak's standardization of Shona, inadvertently contributed to the manufacturing of greater regional Shona identity, in opposition to an equally manufactured greater Ndebele regional identity. This wasn't just about controlling people in the present, it was about actively sculpting and formalizing ethnic divisions, drawing boundaries based on often shaky linguistic or cultural criteria to serve colonial interests. And tragically, sowing seeds of future tensions and conflicts by creating these larger, artificial group identities defined against each other.
It's truly fascinating and disturbing how the tools of scholarship, like linguistic standardization, could be weaponized, even perhaps unintentionally, to fragment a population for political control. It highlights the insidious reach of coloniality into almost every sphere.
It absolutely does. Yet, despite this fragmentation, African nationalism emerged as a powerful counter-response, albeit one deeply shaped, inevitably, by the very forces it resisted. Nationalism became, as one source puts it, a laboratory within which African identities were created. It aimed to forge a common African identity, a sense of unity across these imposed divisions, seeking to make African citizens out of colonial subjects by homogenizing ethnic, racial, and religious differences under a new, shared national banner.
But it sounds like this burgeoning nationalism often struggled against the very divisions colonialism had put in place, sometimes even replicating some of those same issues like ethnic tensions, rather than truly transcending them.
Indeed, that's a crucial point. African nationalism itself was often a deeply interpellated phenomenon, meaning it was significantly shaped by, called into being by, the immanent logic of colonialism, including its racist and ethnic undertones. Many nationalist leaders themselves struggled with what W.E.B. Du Bois famously called double consciousness, or what others describe as a deeply bifurcated consciousness. Having been educated in colonial schools, socialized to hate Africa that produced them and to like Europe that rejected them, as one poignant quote puts it, often dreaming in both African and European languages, embodying a fundamental internal conflict.
Wow, that's a powerful internal struggle.
It is. And while nationalist governments often succeeded in achieving deracialization, dismantling the most overt forms of racial privilege and legal discrimination against Africans, they frequently failed to truly democratize the underlying structures of power inherited from colonialism. This led to what Mahmoud Mamdani calls deracialization without democratization. The benefits of independence, the spoils of office, access to resources, were often unequally distributed. This frequently resulted in the division of the majority population along regional, religious, ethnic, and sometimes familial lines when it came to the redistribution of power and wealth, recreating internal tensions that colonialism had exploited or even created. The competition for scarce resources often fell along these fault lines.
The Zimbabwean experience you mentioned earlier seems like a stark example here. Our sources say Zimbabwean nationalism was tragically born with a bad birthmark due to the 1963 split between the two main liberation movements, ZANU and ZAPU, largely along ethnic lines, which then led to terrible black-on-black violence, both before and especially after independence.
Yes.
It seems it created a nation-state, a sovereign political entity, recognized internationally but devastatingly, failed to create a unified nation as people, leaving this legacy of contested belonging, ethnic manipulation, and cycles of violence that has haunted the country for decades.
That Zimbabwean example powerfully illustrates the internal contradictions and the immense challenges that nationalist movements faced across the continent. The nationalist project of creating a collective community transcending ethnicities was often flouted by the very people who coined it, as one source puts it, demonstrating the immense difficulty of overcoming divisions that had been systematically entrenched and politicized for so long. It really raises that difficult question. How can you truly build a unified nation when its very foundations are fragmented by colonial design and when the liberation movements themselves are sometimes marked by internal contradictions and power struggles? It leaves persistent challenges in defining authentic citizenship, national identity, and a shared sense of belonging. A profound hurdle.
Definitely a profound hurdle. Yet, despite all these challenges, there was also this broader vision, wasn't there? Pan-Africanism.
Yes, absolutely. Despite the internal contradictions of specific nationalisms and the fragmentation inherited from colonialism, Pan-Africanism consistently aimed at a higher ideal. It sought to unify the dismembered continent and its diverse peoples, including the diaspora, into a common, shared identity, fostering solidarity across national borders. Think of the powerful concept from Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, remembering Africa.
Remembering, like
Yeah.
putting the pieces back together.
Exactly. It speaks directly to this quest for wholeness, a deliberate effort to reconnect a continent dismembered, both physically and psychologically, by the arbitrary lines drawn at the Berlin Conference, the Berlin Consensus that divided Africa among European powers in 1884-85 without any regard for existing societies. Pan-Africanism sought to reconstruct a fragmented past and project a unified future, fighting against that imposed division.
So this suggests that the fight for freedom isn't just political or economic. It's also deeply intellectual and cultural. It's about reclaiming thought, reclaiming identity, reclaiming history from these imposed structures.
Yeah.
It's what our sources call an African epistemological rebellion, a struggle for mental and cultural liberation to match or maybe even precede true political independence. It's about forging a new narrative for Africa, from within Africa, rather than just reacting to external lenses.
Precisely. It's a struggle on multiple fronts, and the intellectual, the epistemological front is absolutely crucial, which leads us directly into how these inherited structures, both institutional and mental, played out in post-colonial governance itself, often reproducing patterns of violence and authoritarianism.
Right. Because independence didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. A critical insight from our sources is that the post-colonial state in Africa could not invent governance from scratch. It wasn't a blank slate wiped clean on Independence Day. Instead, it inherited its knowledge of governance, its institutional architecture, its administrative routines, its fundamental structures from multiple sources, but particularly from colonial rationality, the logic of the colonial state. The sources emphasize this point strongly. The achievement of political independence only changed the composition of the managers of the state, but not the character of the state itself. The systems often remained largely intact, just with new faces, African faces, in charge.
So the colonial blueprint for control, that bifurcated state, the commandment mentality, it largely remained. Just with African leaders replacing European ones, it sounds less like a fundamental transformation and more like a changing of the guards.
Essentially, yes, that's the argument presented here. The bifurcated state, which we discussed with its different rules for urban elites and rural masses, its reliance on coercion was often deracialized in form. Overt racial discrimination against Africans was removed. African elites could now occupy positions of power,
Okay.
but it was often not fundamentally democratized in its essence. The underlying power structures, the fused power in rural areas, the coercive mechanisms, the lack of accountability, these often persisted. This led to what our sources call a repetition without difference in many cases, where key aspects of the colonial legacy, particularly its repressive and authoritarian tendencies, were reproduced, sometimes even intensified, in post-colonial governance. The colonial state's DNA of coercion became, tragically, the DNA of many post-colonial states. The new managers simply adopted and adapted the existing tools of power they inherited.
So how did this reproduction manifest? Did it look the same everywhere?
Not exactly the same, no. The sources identified different patterns. Conservative post-colonial states, those that didn't attempt radical transformation, often directly reproduced the decentralized despotism of the colonial native authorities. They maintained a regime of compulsions highlighted as customary, continuing to rely on chiefs, sometimes renaming them, for local control, tax collection, land allocation, and administrative duties, albeit now under a new national government instead of a colonial one. Power remained localized and often arbitrary at that level.
Okay, so keeping the old local structures, what about the more radical states, those that aim for revolution or socialism?
Well, ironically, even radical states, which ostensibly aimed to break with the colonial past, reform this legacy, and promote development or revolution, often encountered similar problems. They often abolished traditional chiefship, seeing it as a colonial relic, but they frequently replaced it not with genuine local democracy, but with a centralized administrative force, district commissioners, party cadres, youth militias dispatched from the capital. This often led to what Mondani calls a modern centralized despotism, effectively shifting the coercive power from local chiefs, who at least had some local ties, to central administrative figures or party functionaries who are often outsiders and equally, if not more, unaccountable to the local people.
So it sounds less like a genuine transformation towards democracy and more like just a rebranding of control, replacing one iron fist, the chief under the colonials, with another iron fist, the party cadre or administrator from the center. But for the people experiencing it on the ground, did it feel identically oppressive? Or were there subtle differences maybe in the justifications used, even within that perpetuated authoritarianism that made it feel distinct from direct colonial rule?
That's a crucial question. Our sources state quite starkly. Even if there was a change in the title of functionaries from chiefs to cadres, there was little change in the nature of power. If anything, the fist of colonial power that was the local state was tightened and strengthened.
Tightened and strengthened, wow.
Yeah. While the ideology justifying the coercion might have shifted from a colonial civilizing mission to a nationalist project of development, nation building, or socialism for the ordinary person, particularly the peasant, the daily experience of power often remained profoundly coercive, arbitrary, and top-down. In fact, in some cases, the argument is it became more intense because the new post-colonial state often had greater reach into rural areas, better technology, a more unified ideological message, and fewer external constraints than the sometimes overstretched colonial state. In both conservative and radical cases, power became heavily administratively driven. This often intensified extra economic coercion, particularly on the peasantry. Think forced contributions to state projects, villagization schemes, and deepened the divide between town and country. Tanzania's Ujamaa policy under Nyerere is cited as a complex example, initially aimed at promoting communal living and development through persuasion and voluntary resettlement into planned villages.
Right, a socialist vision.
A socialist vision, yes. But when persuasion failed to achieve targets quickly enough, it increasingly devolved into administrative coercion and sometimes outright violence to force people into these villages. It demonstrates how even attempts at positive social change, with perhaps good intentions initially, could inadvertently end up mirroring the very coercive structures of the colonial state they sought to replace.
Here's where it gets really interesting, or perhaps deeply troubling. How those attempts at positive social change, aiming for development or revolution, could somehow end up mirroring the coercive structures. It really speaks to the deep, embedded nature of that coloniality of power, doesn't it? Almost like a default setting for how governance is done, a muscle memory that was incredibly hard to shake off even for revolutionaries.
And this reproduction wasn't just institutional, like keeping the same administrative structures. It was also deeply psychological, impacting the very fabric of society in the minds of those involved. Colonial violence, the constant exposure to it, the normalization of it, profoundly influenced the colonized psyche. As Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and revolutionary thinker from Martinique who worked in Algeria, famously analyzed,
Yes, Fanon.
he noted how abused colonized people often internalize the aggression directed at them. They might manifest this aggressiveness, which has been deposited in his bones against his own people, harboring a permanent dream to become the persecutor themselves, a psychological transference of violence. This tragic cycle, Fanon and others argue, meant that participants in liberation struggles, while fighting against the colonial monsters, could themselves risk becoming monsters too, often internalizing the very brutality they condemned in their enemy.
That's such a powerful and disturbing idea. The cycle of violence where the oppressed can become the oppressor, internalizing the methods of the system they fought against.
It's a tragic paradox, yeah, and it highlights the deep, lasting trauma of colonialism. This, according to our sources, helped reproduce a colonial culture of violence, making violence not just a tool of last resort, but a major feature of post-colonial governance in many places. Leaders might openly boast of having degrees in violence, using it as a primary political solution, as famously seen in Zimbabwe's invocation of Chimurenga, the liberation war ideology, to justify later political violence.
Right.
This kind of ideology often fragmented the population into rigid categories. Patriots, usually defined as loyal ruling party members, war veterans, versus puppets or traitors, opposition members, critical journalists, ethnic minorities, white farmers, anyone perceived as disloyal. This fostered deep polarization and served to justify violence against perceived enemies of the state or the revolution.
And the Gukurahundi example.
Yes, Zimbabwe's Gukurahundi massacres in the 1980s are cited as a tragic example. The state-sponsored 5th Brigade, specifically trained outside normal army structures, killed an estimated 20,000 Ndebele civilians in Matabeleland. This was perceived by many observers and victims as state-sanctioned violence targeting an ethnic minority associated with the political opposition. This kind of state violence, whether large-scale or smaller everyday acts, created a pervasive intimacy of tyranny in some contexts, where, as Mbembe puts it, obscenity is only another aspect of munificence and vulgarity a normal condition of state power. This could manifest in public displays of raw power, including horrifying acts like public floggings, stripped naked in the public markets. These weren't hidden acts of torture. They were often public demonstrations of total, arbitrary power, designed to terrify, humiliate, and control the populace.
Public floggings. Stripped naked in the public markets. That's a truly chilling detail, a grotesque public assertion of power over the body. It makes you pause and consider the immense psychological toll this must have taken on entire populations, the normalization of such degradation. What does it tell us about the dehumanizing power of such a system, that it would allow for such acts to become, in some sense, normal?
It tells us that the colonial legacy of viewing certain bodies, particularly those of the colonized, the native, the other, as property, as disposable, as objects rather than subjects, sadly continued in many post-colonial contexts, just directed now by new masters. This intimacy of tyranny is closely linked to another phenomenon our sources discuss: the commandment's tendency toward self-adoration, which is deeply intertwined with what Achille Mbembe calls an aesthetics of vulgarity.
Aesthetics of vulgarity, what does that mean?
It means that obscenity, excess, and the grotesque become integral parts of how power is performed and maintained. The official discourse often creates this Gulliverian vision of the leader's deeds, making the tiny huge and the familiar strange through exaggeration, spectacle, and disproportionate self-adulation. Think massive rallies, constant propaganda, personality cults.
Right.
The autocrat, the leader, is presented as a fetish, an object aspiring to be sacred, demanding power, feeding on applause, flattery, public displays of loyalty. The leader's effigy portraits everywhere, statues, party cards, uniforms, slogans, they become like amulets, essential for navigating daily life, making the fetish, the leader's presence, omnipresent and inescapable.
Like a theatrical performance of power, then.
Yeah.
Almost ritualistic in its self-aggrandizement, where the leader becomes this larger-than-life, almost godlike figure demanding worship.
Precisely. And often accompanying this is an economy of pleasure and licentiousness, as Mbembe describes it. Rulers indulge in excessive festivities, banquets, celebrations often focus metaphorically and sometimes literally on the mouth, belly, and phallus. Displays of consumption, potency, virility. This can often involve the sexual exploitation of subordinates, with public displays of male virility and the unconditional subordination of women to the principle of male pleasure being part of the courtly life around the autocrat. Mbembe even vividly and controversially describes colonial violence itself in almost sexualized terms as a sparky, clean act of coitus, with the characteristic feature of making horror and pleasure coincide, where the colonizer thinks and expresses himself through his phallus, and his cruelty can stand quite naked erect. It's a deeply disturbing linkage of power, violence, and perverse pleasure. It is. This production of vulgarity, this public performance of excess and obscenity, is seen as a cynical operation, akin to the production of lies and doublespeak found in other authoritarian regimes. It numbs, it degrades, it asserts dominance through shock and awe, and popular humor, popular culture often reflects this reality, offering caricatures of autocrats as vampires, as gluttonous giants, as boa constrictors, devouring the people's resources. It's a way people cope with and critique the grotesque realities beneath the pomp and the official narratives.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. The reproduction of violence, the aesthetics of vulgarity. It paints a bleak picture. But surely there was resistance. People didn't just accept this, did they? Either during colonialism or after?
Absolutely not. That's the crucial other side of the story. Despite the overwhelming architecture of control and the deliberate colonial attempts at fragmentation, African identities, even those manipulated by colonialism, also became dynamic sites of resistance and contestation. Our sources highlight that custom and tribalism, while definitely used by colonizers for control, also became languages through which local people could protest, make claims, and demand rights. They could turn the colonizers' own tools and categories against them in unexpected ways.
So a civil war within the tribe, as our sources dramatically put it. People fighting back not just against the distant colonial power in the capital, but against the very local structures, the chiefs, the native authorities that claimed to represent their tradition, but were actually enforcing colonial rule.
Yes, exactly that. The anti-colonial struggle, especially for the peasantry, was often first and foremost a struggle against the hierarchy of the local state, the tribally organized native authority, because that's where power was most directly experienced. And since that local state was tribally organized and controlled, peasant resistance inevitably took the form, as Mamdani describes it, of a civil war within the tribe. It was about redefining local authority, challenging the state-ordained customary law, holding the chiefs accountable, or even overthrowing them, contesting power from below.
Okay, and what about in the cities?
In urban settings, especially in places like South Africa with large migrant labor populations, new forms of organization emerged. Migrant workers living in segregated hostels often formed ethnic associations, sometimes called homeboy networks, burial societies, credit associations. These networks, while ethnically organized initially for mutual support, became crucial crucibles for collective action. They enabled migrants to organize, share information, build solidarity, and bring urban resistance tactics like strikes, boycotts, demonstrations back to their rural areas. They also became key bases for organizing the burgeoning independent trade union movements, uniting workers across ethnic lines for common class-based rights.
That's truly fascinating, how those internal divisions, which were meant to control and isolate people based on ethnicity, could also become unexpected wellsprings of organized resistance. The Durban strikes of 1973 in South Africa, for instance. Our sources call them a magnetic spark, igniting the formation of the independent black workers' unions. And it's noted these were largely driven by migrant workers who were organized through these hostile-based associations. It created a significant turning point in the anti-apartheid struggle, didn't it? Demonstrating collective agency and power in the face of immense oppression.
Absolutely, a pivotal moment. And even later, in the face of attempts by political parties like Inkatha in South Africa to mobilize support strictly along ethnic lines and control these hostels. Our sources share a powerful anecdote about the Transvaal Hostel Residents Association. They successfully organized a rent boycott against an Inkatha-linked council, asserting the need for a civic body representing all residents regardless of ethnicity to represent their interests over narrow political party control.
So they pushed back against ethnic manipulation.
Yes. It showed how ordinary people actively sought to transcend politically manipulated ethnic divisions to secure their local rights and challenge state-imposed or party-imposed authority, demonstrating a profound desire for genuine democratic representation based on shared residents and needs, not just imposed identity.
That's a really hopeful example. Are there other case studies of these kinds of movements trying to reshape power from below?
Yes, Uganda provides some compelling, though complex, case studies of peasant movements attempting to fundamentally reshape power structures, particularly the legacy of the bifurcated state. One is the Rwenzururu movement, which was active mainly from 1962 to 1980. It arose out of intense nationality oppression experienced by the Bakonzo and Bamba peoples in western Uganda.
Well, oppression by whom?
By the dominant Batoro kingdom, which had been favored and empowered by the British colonial administration. The Bakonzo and Bamba faced land deprivation, their languages were excluded from schools and local administration, they faced job discrimination. Classic colonial divide and rule consequences. This led to an armed struggle, a secessionist movement initially, and resulted in significant innovative reforms within the areas they controlled. They aimed specifically at disentangling the fused powers of the chief inherited from colonialism. They established elected popular assemblies and attempted to make chiefs accountable to these new democratic structures.
So trying to implement that democratization that was missing elsewhere.
Exactly. Trying to dismantle the clenched fist at the local level.
But those reforms were ultimately limited, weren't they? If I recall correctly from our sources, they didn't achieve a complete, lasting overhaul of the system.
They were limited, yes. The movement, despite its democratic innovations locally, ultimately faced contradictions. Its leadership replicated some aspects of the monarchy it opposed, with the leader crowning himself king. Furthermore, the popular assemblies, while a step forward, remained predominantly male. Married women were only partly included, mainly allowed to participate in discussions on food policy, reflecting persistent gender inequalities even within the rebellion. And its achievements, like redrawing district boundaries to give the Bakanzo their own district, were eventually co-opted or reversed. The leadership was eventually integrated into the Ugandan state structure, becoming, as Mamdani puts it, custodians of the very order they had originally organized against. It illustrates the immense difficulty of sustaining radical change when leadership gets co-opted, or when fundamental structural issues at the central state level remain unaddressed, or when internal contradictions aren't resolved.
Okay, so a complex legacy there. What was the other Ugandan example?
The other, perhaps more widely known, is the National Resistance Army, NRA, and its political wing, the National Resistance Movement, NRM, led by Yoweri Museveni, which waged a guerrilla war from 1981 and came to power in 1986.
Right, Museveni's movement.
Yes. They took a more radical approach, institutionally speaking, in the areas they controlled during the war. They directly abolished the position of the chief altogether, seeing it purely as a colonial imposition. And they replaced it with resistance councils, RCs, later renamed local councils. These were conceived as village legislatures, elected bodies from the village level upwards, intended to be the basis of local self-governance, giving ordinary people direct participation in decision-making. A significant democratic experiment.
So really trying to build power from the ground up.
That was the idea. And a seminal contribution of the NREM, particularly highlighted in our sources, was redefining the basis of rights in these councils from descent, meaning belonging to a particular indigenous ethnic group, to residence.
From descent to residence, what did that mean in practice?
It meant that anyone residing in a village for a certain period, regardless of their ethnic origin, had the right to vote and stand for election in the RCs. This was crucial because it allowed the NRM to forge vital alliances between the indigenous peasants in areas like the Luero Triangle and migrant strangers, often refugees or laborers from other parts of Uganda or even neighboring countries. It demonstrated a unifying potential beyond the ethnic divisions that colonialism had entrenched, creating a broader, more inclusive sense of civic belonging based on living together, not just shared ancestry.
That shift from descent to residence sounds like a truly transformative idea for citizenship, doesn't it? Moving beyond those rigid colonial ethnic categories towards a more inclusive civic model, fostering unity rather than perpetuating division.
It was a crucial innovation, yes. It fostered broader alliances during the war and offered a potential model for a more inclusive post-conflict society. However, the story gets complicated after 1986, once the NRM seized central power. This decentralized democracy, which was largely confined to the local state, the RCs, proved partial and unstable because it wasn't accompanied by corresponding comprehensive democratic reforms at the central state level. Power remained highly centralized in the presidency.
Okay, so the top didn't match the bottom.
Exactly. And confronted by political challenges and accusations of being dominated by certain ethnic groups, the NRM regime increasingly resorted to seeking ethnic alliances to consolidate its power centrally. This even included restoring the traditional kingdoms, like the powerful Buganda kingdom, which they had previously opposed. Our sources suggest this move risks liquidating the democratic potential of the council system in the villages by reintroducing traditional, often non-accountable, hereditary hierarchies alongside the elected councils. It really raises that important recurring question. How challenging is it to truly bridge the urban-rural divide, the inter-ethnic divides, without comprehensive system-wide democratic reform at all levels of the state, ensuring that local democratic gains aren't undermined by central political expediency or the enduring pull of older, sometimes colonial-era power structures?
It's constant tension, it seems.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to that idea of decolonizing the mind, because maybe the political and institutional structures are only part of the battle.
Absolutely. Beyond the political struggles, the economic challenges, the institutional reforms, a profound intellectual and psychological battle is seen as central to achieving genuine liberation, the project of decolonizing the mind. Stu Bentubiko and the Black consciousness movement in South Africa during apartheid explicitly represented this project. Their aim wasn't just political rights. It was for a nation inhabited by thoroughly decolonized and proud Africans.
Right. Psychological liberation first.
Yes, encompassing a psychological and cultural liberation, a mental decolonization that went far beyond mere political deracialization or formal equality. It was about instilling self-pride, reclaiming Black identity from the negativity imposed by white supremacy, fostering agency, and reevaluating African value systems on their own terms.
And Ngugi wa Thiong'o's influential work, the book actually titled Decolonizing the Mind, comes immediately to mind here too. He's been a powerful voice on this.
Absolutely. Ngugi has argued passionately for reconstituting African states and societies based on African history, African knowledge systems, African languages, and positive cultural values. He critiques the continued use of imported Euro-American ideas and institutions in post-colonial Africa, arguing they perpetuate dependency. He poignantly describes the crisis of African intellectuals often compelled to operate within the prison house of European linguistic memory. Written in English or French, engaging primarily with European theoretical frameworks.
Meaning their work serves European traditions more than African ones.
That's his argument. That African experiences primarily serve, in that context, to enrich the already very rich European memory, rather than developing a robust, independent African thought rooted in African languages and conceptual frameworks. This mental colonization, Ngugi and others argue, is the hardest part to decolonize. It's perhaps the worst form of colonialism because it stole the African souls, invaded their consciousness, destroyed and distorted their imagination of the future. It makes people internalize the idea that their own cultures, languages, histories, and ways of knowing are inherently inferior to those of the colonizer.
So this isn't just about what we learn, like adding African history to the curriculum. It's about how we learn, whose frameworks we use, what languages we think and create in. It seems Western knowledge was often presented, mystified maybe, as universal, objective, scientific.
Exactly.
While African knowledge systems, medicine, agriculture, philosophy, spirituality were displaced, marginalized, dismissed as primitive or superstitious, creating this deep epistemological dependency.
Yes, that's the core of the critique.
So for instance, in agriculture, solutions to African food security might be sought primarily through Western models of industrial farming, using imported seeds and chemicals, potentially overlooking or undermining effective, sustainable indigenous farming techniques adapted to local conditions over centuries. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
That's a perfect example, yes. The goal of this African epistemological rebellion, then, isn't just about adding African content into existing Western structures. It's about fundamentally questioning and reshaping those structures, those lenses themselves. It asks, whose theories are we using to define our problems and find our solutions? Are we just trying to catch up to a Western model of modernity, or are we building something authentically rooted in our own diverse experiences, values, and intellectual traditions? It means, as Enrique Dussel, a Latin American liberation philosopher, puts it, changing the terms in addition to the content of the conversation. Not just adopting or adapting Western frameworks, but critically examining their colonial origins and developing alternative frameworks from an authentic African and, more broadly, Global South perspective.
Changing the terms of the conversation.
Yeah.
That's key. It feels like this ties into the final points in our sources about the difference between emancipation and true liberation.
Precisely. Ultimately, our sources draw this crucial distinction between emancipation and liberation, particularly in the context of decolonization. Emancipation is described as essentially reformist. Rooted often in Enlightenment discourse about rights and citizenship, it proposes changes within the existing system, maybe extending rights, removing formal discrimination, allowing participation, but without fundamentally questioning the core logic of coloniality or Western modernity itself. It often serves, critics argue, to offer concessions, manage dissent, while ultimately securing a new lease on life for the underlying oppressive systems, allowing them to adapt and survive in a new guise.
Okay, so emancipation is like getting a seat at the existing table.
Yeah.
And liberation, that's more radical. Seeking to overturn the table itself.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Liberation, in this framework, seeks total change. It challenges the entire edifice of Western modernity and its associated logics of capitalism, racism, patriarchy, the nation-state model itself. It encompasses both political economic independence and, crucially, that epistemological freedom we just discussed, a freedom of thought, knowledge production, and self-definition, a complete break from the colonial matrix. However, the argument in many of these critical sources is that the decolonization project in Africa was often hijacked by the native bourgeoisie, the new African elites, and channeled towards emancipation, not liberation.
Why was there interest?
Because they were often more interested in replacing the white colonial elites, taking over their positions, privileges, and control of the state apparatus, rather than fundamentally transforming the exploitative system itself. They wanted the master's house, not to build a completely new one. This often led to that repetition without difference we talked about, where the post-colonial state reproduced colonial structures and divisions just with black faces in power, benefiting a new elite while the masses saw little fundamental change.
South Africa's post-1994 experience, after the formal end of apartheid, is often cited as a powerful and perhaps poignant example of this tension, isn't it? Our sources describe it as achieving liberal democracy without decolonization.
Precisely. It's presented as a key case study. The attainment of juridical freedom for the state becoming a non-racial democratic nation on paper with the celebrated Constitution was mistakenly conflated, critics argue, with genuine popular freedom and substantive liberation for the majority of ordinary black citizens.
How so?
Well, the 1996 Constitution, while progressive in guaranteeing political and civil rights, is criticized in these sources for protecting existing property rights, including ill-gotten wealth concentrated in the hands of white bourgeoisie and a few black elites, and for not facilitating radical redistribution of resources like land and mineral wealth, which remain highly unequal along racial lines. The argument is that the colonial matrix of power, the deep structures of economic inequality, spatial segregation inherited from apartheid, and racial hierarchy persisted largely intact, even with a black government in power, leading to deracialization without democratization in a substantive economic and social sense. This illustrates how global coloniality can continue to operate, perpetuating colonial forms of domination, economic exploitation, and external control through mechanisms like international finance, IMF, and World Bank conditionalities, and the power of multinational corporations, even within a formally independent and democratic state. It creates this complex, entangled situation, this post-colonial, neo-colonized world.
This post-colonial, neo-colonized world. That phrase really captures the complexity, the entanglement, doesn't it? It underscores why genuine liberation, in the deeper sense these sources describe, remains an ongoing, unfinished struggle, a multifaceted project that extends far beyond just lowering a colonial flag or writing a new constitution. It's a continuous, deep, and often painful process of trying to dismantle those enduring structures, both external and internal.
Exactly. It's not a closed chapter at all.
We've certainly taken a comprehensive deep dive today into this concept of the coloniality of power. We've traced its, frankly, violent foundations, its pervasive economic mechanisms, its profound and often destructive impact on identity, and its troubling reproduction of authoritarianism and violence in post-colonial governance. What's become abundantly clear, I think, is that colonialism didn't just end cleanly. It evolved, it morphed, leaving behind this persistent matrix of power, this ghost in the machine that continues to shape African realities and indeed global realities, often in subtle but deeply entrenched ways that are still being contested and fought today.
Yeah, and understanding this, grappling with these ideas, isn't just about historical facts or some abstract academic theory. It's really essential, I believe, for comprehending contemporary global inequalities, political instabilities across the continent and beyond, and the ongoing vital struggles for self-determination, for genuine development, and for true liberation in Africa. It encourages us, hopefully, to look beyond simplistic narratives of independence or failed states and recognize the pervasive multidimensional nature of this enduring power structure, how it operates not just in Africa, but how it fundamentally shapes global relations between the North and South.
So what does this all mean for you listening in today? As a learner, as maybe a global citizen trying to engage thoughtfully with the world, if mental colonization is indeed, as Ngugi suggests, the hardest part to decolonize, and if it's so deeply intertwined with economic and political control, what concrete steps can any of us take to truly contribute to a decolonized future? What knowledge systems, what perspectives, what voices do we still unconsciously privilege in our own thinking, in our media consumption, in our education? And how can we actively seek out, listen to, and genuinely value alternative perspectives, whether from the global south, from indigenous communities, from marginalized voices closer to home, to challenge these deep-seated structures of power, both out there in the world and maybe even within ourselves? It's definitely a question worth continually asking, something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.